The cold wind howled across the vast, frozen landscape. It was early morning, and the world seemed still, as if nothing could move in the thick blanket of snow. In the distance, the mountains stood tall, their peaks covered in white, untouched snow. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath the boots of a lone fisherman walking to his cabin. Inside the small wooden cabin, the air was crisp and fresh. The warmth of the fire crackled softly, filling the room with a comforting glow. The fisherman, a man in his late 50s with a thick beard and weathered skin, sat at a small table near the window. His hands, strong from years of labor, carefully mended a net, preparing it for another day of fishing. His name was Tomas, and he had lived in this remote part of the world for as long as he could remember. Every day, he woke before the sun and worked hard, alone with his thoughts and the wilderness. There were no neighbors, no family, just the endless snow, the icy waters, and the quiet company of the few animals that roamed this frozen world. Tomas had chosen this life for its peace. The silence of the Arctic was unlike anything else. Here, he didn't have to answer to anyone, no one to worry about. He was free, but the isolation also made him feel like a stranger in the world. Every day, he kept his routine, fishing, maintaining his cabin, and listening to the sounds of nature. Outside the cabin, the weather had been growing harsher over the past few days. The winds picked up, making the snow swirl around like a thick fog. But Tomas wasn't worried. He was used to the harsh conditions. He had learned how to survive in these extreme environments, how to read the sky and the wind, how to listen to the quiet noises of nature. He had become one with the cold. Today, though, there was something different. The air felt heavier, thicker. Tomas couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt as if something was about to happen. Something out of the ordinary. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, or maybe it was the change in the weather. Whatever it was, Tomas couldn't shake the feeling that the wilderness was about to surprise him in a way he hadn't expected. As he finished his work, Tomas got up from the table, stretching his tired limbs. The small cabin creaked around him as the wind outside grew louder. He turned towards the door, the only way in or out of the cabin. He didn't know it yet, but something was waiting just beyond it, something that would change his life forever. The day had started like any other. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a pale blue glow over the endless white landscape. Tomas sat by the small window, sipping his warm cup of tea as he watched the snow fall gently outside. The silence was so deep, it almost felt as if the world had stopped moving. He had learned to appreciate this quiet. It was the kind of silence that came with isolation, a calm that allowed him to think clearly. There were no distractions here, no cars, no city noise, just the sound of the wind and the crunch of snow beneath his boots when he walked outside. Tomas finished his tea and set the cup down on the table. He glanced over at the small stove in the corner of the room, the fire flickering quietly. The warmth from the stove was a comforting presence in the cabin. Tomas wasn't one to complain about the cold, but the warmth made it easier to relax. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking with age, and moved to the window. The world outside looked untouched, as if no one had been there for years. The snowflakes fell steadily, the wind howling as it whipped through the trees. Tomas knew the storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The wind had picked up, swirling in unpredictable patterns. The air had a sharpness to it, almost as if nature was warning him. For a moment, Tomas stood in front of the window, just watching the snow. He knew the signs. He had seen many storms in his time here. Some came quickly, without warning, while others gave a bit more time to prepare. But they were always the same: fierce, wild, and unforgiving. The kind of storm that could keep you trapped in your cabin for days, if not longer. Tomas didn't mind the storms. He had spent enough time in this remote wilderness to know how to survive them. He always made sure to keep extra food, firewood, and supplies just in case. But there was something different today. Something about the storm made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was almost as if the wind was trying to tell him something. He turned away from the window and went to the small closet in the corner of the room. He pulled out his thick, weatherproof jacket and gloves, preparing for the worst. It wasn't the storm that worried him, but the feeling of unease that seemed to be growing inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something more than just the storm. Tomas grabbed his boots and slowly pulled them on, the leather creaking as he tied them tightly. He took one last look around the cabin, making sure everything was in place. There was a calm to the cabin, but it was the kind of calm that felt unnatural. The silence outside had become almost too loud, a warning he couldn't ignore. He walked to the door and paused, his hand resting on the handle. The wind howled louder now, rattling the walls of the cabin as if it were trying to get inside. Tomas hesitated for a moment. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there, beyond the door. His breath came out in short bursts, fogging up the window as he stared into the storm. With a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped out into the snow. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp and biting. He pulled his hood up over his head and fastened the jacket tightly around his chest. The wind whipped through his clothes, but he was used to it. Tomas had faced worse conditions in his years here. Still, something about today felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension that made his senses sharpen. As he walked across the yard, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, he kept looking over his shoulder, feeling as if something was following him. It was just his mind playing tricks, he told himself. The storm was making him nervous. The wind seemed to grow stronger as he moved toward the fishing shed, where he stored his gear. Tomas had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him to stay alert. He had been living alone in the wilderness long enough to know when something was out of place, and today, everything felt off. He reached the shed and stepped inside, out of the wind. The air inside was colder than the cabin, but he didn't mind. He was used to the cold, used to being alone in the quiet of nature. He set his fishing tools down on the table, making sure everything was in order. His mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling he had earlier. It was as if the storm was building up to something more than just a typical snowstorm. The wind howled again, shaking the walls of the shed. Tomas stood still, his senses on high alert. He couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Something was coming. It wasn't just the storm. It was something else. Something bigger. Something he couldn't explain. Tomas stepped back outside, squinting against the fierce wind. He looked around, trying to see through the swirling snow. The trees were bending under the weight of the wind, their branches creaking as they swayed. The world outside felt like it was being swallowed by the storm. The sky had turned a dark, angry gray, and Tomas knew that this storm was like no other. As he stood there, staring out into the white abyss, he heard a noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. A soft thud, then another. His heart began to race as he turned slowly, his eyes scanning the area around him. The noise came again, closer this time. A sound he couldn't ignore. Tomas held his breath, the tension in the air thickening as the storm raged around him. The noise wasn't from the wind. It was something else, something that had just entered the scene. The wind howled louder than ever, swirling around Tomas as he stood there, looking out into the storm. His breath was quick and shallow, the cold air biting at his skin. His instincts told him to be cautious, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the veil of snow. Then, the noise came again. This time, it was much closer. A soft, heavy thud in the snow, followed by a scraping sound. It was almost like something large was moving through the thick snowdrifts. Tomas's heart skipped a beat. He turned, squinting against the wind, trying to see through the snow. The storm had grown even more intense, the swirling flakes making it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet. Tomas held his breath and listened again. The noise wasn't the wind. It was something else, something moving slowly but deliberately. It was drawing nearer. His first thought was that it might be a bear, one of the large creatures that roamed these parts in search of food. But this was no ordinary bear. The sounds it made were too heavy, too purposeful. Tomas's hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung over his shoulder, but something stopped him. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever it was, it hadn't yet shown itself. He didn't want to make any sudden movements. He slowly backed away from the edge of the yard and toward the cabin, his boots crunching in the deep snow. The noise continued, growing louder now. He didn't dare turn his back on it. Suddenly, the figure appeared through the swirling snow, standing at the edge of the yard. Tomas froze. What he saw nearly made him drop the rifle in his hands. It was massive, a polar bear, the largest he had ever seen. Its white fur blended almost perfectly with the snow, but its towering figure made it impossible to miss. The bear stood just a few feet away, its massive paws pressing into the snow as it slowly approached Tomas's cabin. Tomas's breath caught in his throat. The bear wasn't attacking. It was simply standing there, staring at him with dark, intelligent eyes. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if time itself had paused. The bear's size was intimidating. It was taller than Tomas by at least a foot when it stood upright on its hind legs, its massive body nearly blocking the view of the rest of the world. Its fur was thick and matted, dotted with patches of snow that clung to its coat. Tomas could see the muscles in its legs flexing as it shifted its weight, its massive frame moving with surprising grace. The moment felt surreal. Tomas was used to encountering wildlife, but this was different. The bear didn't seem aggressive. It wasn't growling, nor did it appear hungry. Instead, it seemed almost curious. Tomas's first instinct was to retreat back in the cabin, but he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, unable to take his eyes off the creature. The bear remained motionless for a moment, as if studying him, before lowering itself back on all fours. It sniffed the air in Tomas's direction, its large nostrils flaring with each breath. Tomas's mind raced. Was it injured? Why was it here, in the middle of this storm, so close to his home? He had never seen a polar bear act this way before. They were normally solitary creatures, avoiding human contact at all costs. Was this bear lost? Hungry? As Tomas continued to stare at the bear, a sudden, sharp noise broke the silence. A soft grunt, followed by a slow shuffle. Tomas flinched, but the bear didn't move. Instead, it looked back over its shoulder, as if searching for something. In that moment, Tomas realized something even stranger. The bear didn't seem to be alone. Something else was hidden just behind the large creature. Tomas squinted through the snow and finally saw it. A smaller, weaker polar bear cub, its fur matted and dirty, its movements slow and clumsy. It struggled to keep up with the larger bear, its tiny paws slipping in the snow. Tomas's heart sank. He had seen many animals struggle to survive in the wild, but the sight of this cub, clearly weak and struggling, stirred something deep inside him. The larger bear turned its head and nudged the cub gently with its nose, urging it forward. Tomas couldn't help but feel a rush of compassion for the creatures, knowing how harsh the Arctic winters could be. The realization hit him like a wave. These animals were not here to harm him. They were simply trying to survive. For a long moment, Tomas stood in the deepening storm, watching the two bears. He knew he had to make a decision. He could close the door, stay inside, and wait for the storm to pass. Or he could try to help them, offer something to keep them safe. The choice wasn't easy. He had to decide quickly, before the storm became worse. Tomas stood frozen, watching the polar bear and its cub. The wind howled louder, but he barely heard it anymore. His heart was racing as he stared at the two creatures, their presence breaking through the deep silence of the Arctic. The bear seemed calm, but Tomas knew the wilderness could change in an instant. He had seen animals in desperate situations before, and when they were desperate, they were dangerous. The larger bear gently nudged the cub again, and Tomas could see how weak it was. The little bear's movements were slow and unsteady, its steps leaving uneven prints in the snow. Tomas's heart ached at the sight. This cub wasn't going to make it on its own. The storm was getting worse, and without shelter or food, survival would be nearly impossible. Tomas had seen his fair share of tough moments living alone in this wilderness, but this was different. He had never encountered a bear in such a vulnerable state, and he didn't know what to do. His mind raced, torn between two thoughts: protect himself from the danger of a desperate animal, or help the struggling creatures in front of him. As he hesitated, the larger bear turned its head and glanced at Tomas. Their eyes locked for a moment. The bear's gaze was deep, intelligent, but also full of caution. Tomas couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the animal. It wasn't just a wild beast. This bear was a mother, doing whatever it took to protect her cub. For a second, Tomas considered going back inside the cabin and locking the door. After all, a mother bear would do anything to protect its young, and he knew from experience that bears were not afraid to attack when they felt threatened. But then he thought about the cub. He couldn't turn away, not when they were in such desperate need. His feet moved slowly toward the cabin door, his fingers fumbling to unlock it. The bears hadn't moved yet, but Tomas knew that every moment he spent thinking could make the situation worse. His mind was racing. He had to make a decision, and fast. Suddenly, the cub took a step forward, but its tiny legs buckled beneath it. It fell hard into the snow, letting out a weak whimper. Tomas's breath caught in his throat. The bear mother turned sharply, her powerful body moving quickly toward the cub. She nudged it gently with her nose, urging it to stand. But the cub couldn't move. Tomas watched helplessly as the mother bear tried again and again, but the cub's limbs were too weak, too slow to respond. A cold dread filled Tomas's chest. The storm was closing in, and the bears were stuck outside in the middle of it. If he didn't act, they might both die. The wind was picking up, howling through the trees, and the snow was now falling in thick sheets, covering the ground and making it harder to see. Tomas felt the pressure building. He had to do something. Without thinking, he pulled open the cabin door and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a slap, but he didn't care. His focus was entirely on the bears. He moved quickly, crossing the yard toward them, the snow crunching under his boots with every step. The bear mother seemed to notice him now. She stood up on her hind legs, towering over Tomas. Her eyes were wide, filled with a warning, but Tomas didn't stop. He kept moving forward, slowly and carefully. He didn't want to startle her. He knew that if he made any sudden moves, the bear could attack. Tomas reached the cub, kneeling down beside it. The little bear let out a soft cry, and Tomas's heart broke. It was so small, so fragile. The storm was relentless, and the cub's tiny body was shaking with cold and exhaustion. Tomas gently placed a hand on the cub's fur, trying to comfort it, but it was clear that the cub didn't have the strength to move on its own. The mother bear let out a low growl, a warning that sent a chill down Tomas's spine. He froze, looking up at her. Her eyes were full of suspicion, and Tomas knew that one wrong move could turn this moment into a dangerous one. He had to be careful, but he also knew that if he didn't act quickly, the cub might not survive the storm. His mind raced as he looked back at the cabin. He could bring the cub inside, but that meant getting both bears to trust him enough to let him near them. The storm was getting worse, and if the bears didn't get shelter, they would be in serious danger. Tomas slowly stood up, his gaze never leaving the mother bear. She was still watching him carefully, but she wasn't charging at him. He stepped back just a little, making sure to keep a safe distance. He had to think of a way to get them inside, where they would be safe from the storm. "Come on," Tomas whispered to himself. Think. Suddenly, an idea hit him. The food he kept inside the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them something to survive on for a few days. If he could use the food to lure the bears inside, he might be able to get them to safety. Tomas turned and rushed back to the cabin door, quickly grabbing a sack of dried fish he had stored for himself. He carefully opened it, taking out a piece of the fish. He held it up, showing it to the bears. He didn't want to take any chances, but he needed them to trust him enough to come closer. The mother bear sniffed the air, and her dark eyes narrowed as she took a cautious step forward. Tomas froze again, his heart pounding. Would this work? Will they come inside? The cub let out another weak whimper, and the mother turned back toward it. She nudged the cub gently, urging it forward. Then, to Tomas's surprise, she began walking toward him, slowly but steadily, following the scent of the fish. The cub stumbled behind her, its tiny body struggling to keep up. Tomas held his breath, watching them both move closer. The tension in the air was thick. He knew the situation was far from safe, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Tomas's heart raced as he held the fish in front of him, his hand trembling with the weight of the moment. The mother bear was only a few feet away now, her massive frame looming in the snow. The cub, weak and wobbly, followed closely behind, still struggling to keep up. The tension in the air was so thick that Tomas could barely breathe. The mother bear sniffed the fish, her dark eyes flickering with cautious interest. Tomas slowly backed away, step by step, careful not to make any sudden movements. His mind raced with questions. Would they really come inside? Would they trust him enough? The storm was growing fiercer with every passing minute, and time was running out. Then, without warning, the mother bear took a cautious step forward. Tomas stopped, his heart in his throat. The bear's eyes were locked onto his every movement. She was so close now that Tomas could feel the heat of her breath, even through the storm's chill. But he didn't move. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. If she saw him as a threat, it would all be over. Another step. The bear's claws scraped against the snow as she inched closer, her movements slow but deliberate. The cub followed, its tiny paws leaving soft tracks in the deep snow. Tomas took a deep breath. He had to stay calm. His mind flashed to his family, his home back in the village, and then to the animals standing before him, desperate for help. He couldn't leave them out there. Suddenly, the mother bear lunged forward. Tomas's body stiffened, and his heart skipped a beat. Was she attacking? His hand shot to the rifle at his side, but before he could make a move, the bear's huge head nudged the sack of fish. She grabbed a piece with her teeth, chewing it slowly, and then backed away, looking over her shoulder at Tomas. The cub, now less shaky, approached the food as well. Tomas's breath came out in a sigh of relief, but his heart was still racing. They were eating. They were finally trusting him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The howling wind, the swirling snow, the biting cold, all of it faded into the background as Tomas stood in the middle of the storm, watching the mother bear and her cub devour the food he had given them. Then, in a flash, the calm was shattered. The mother bear suddenly turned and growled deeply, her eyes narrowing. Tomas's blood ran cold as a deep rumbling sound filled the air. He whirled around, his instincts telling him something was wrong. Out of the swirling snow, a shadow emerged, a larger bear, its massive form appearing out of nowhere. Tomas barely had time to react before the bear charged. The ground shook with its force, and the storm's fury seemed to pale in comparison to the terror in Tomas's chest. The mother bear, still standing in front of Tomas, stepped between him and the new threat, her powerful frame a shield. She growled fiercely, her claws digging into the snow, ready to defend. Tomas stood frozen in fear, unsure of what would happen next. He could see the fear in the cub's eyes, but also the determination in the mother bear's stance. Everything hung in the balance as the two bears faced each other, the wind swirling around them. Tomas held his breath, hoping the mother bear would protect him and her cub long enough to get them to safety. The climax of this battle for survival had begun, and there was no turning back. The storm howled louder, but Tomas barely heard it over the pounding of his heart. The new bear, massive and aggressive, stood just a few feet away. The mother bear growled again, her body low to the ground, ready to defend her cub and Tomas. The wind whipped through the snow, but everything else was eerily quiet. Tomas held his breath, unable to move, as he waited for the next action. For a moment, it seemed like the two bears were going to clash. The new bear snarled, its teeth bared and eyes filled with rage. But the mother bear didn't back down. She stood tall and firm, her protective instincts flaring. The tension between them was palpable, and Tomas knew that any moment could turn into a fight for survival. But then, something unexpected happened. The larger bear hesitated. It sniffed the air, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. It wasn't fear Tomas saw in its gaze, but a deep understanding, like the wild had spoken to both of them. The larger bear slowly backed away, its posture relaxing. The mother bear kept her ground, but she didn't move to attack. She watched the new bear retreat, her eyes tracking it as it disappeared back into the snowstorm. It was as though she had claimed the space as her own, and the larger bear recognized it. Tomas stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest, unsure if it was over or if the danger would return. The mother bear slowly turned back to him and her cub, the tension in her body easing as she nudged her cub to continue eating the food Tomas had provided. After a long moment, Tomas took a cautious step forward, his hand still clutching the sack of fish. He didn't want to risk spooking them, but he knew the bears needed rest, and the shelter of the cabin was the safest place for them. The storm showed no sign of letting up, but the danger had passed, for now. Tomas carefully walked toward the door, keeping his distance, hoping the mother bear would follow. She looked at him once more, her eyes softening as she guided the cub closer. As Tomas opened the cabin door, the bear mother and her cub hesitated for a moment, then followed him inside. He quickly closed the door behind them, grateful that they had made it through the worst of the storm. Now, it was a matter of keeping them safe. Inside the warmth of the cabin, Tomas allowed himself a deep sigh of relief. The storm raged on outside, but inside, for the first time in a long while, Tomas didn't feel quite so alone. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. Tomas watched as the mother bear curled up in a corner, her cub nestled against her side, both of them resting peacefully. The food Tomas had given them had helped, but the real gift was the shelter, the safety he had provided in the heart of the storm. For the first time since he had moved to this lonely cabin, Tomas didn't feel like he was living alone. The bond between him and the animals was something he had never expected to find in the wilderness. He had always admired the resilience of nature, but seeing this bear family, struggling yet strong, filled him with a deep sense of connection. The storm outside began to settle, the winds dying down. Tomas slowly sat down on a chair, watching the bears sleep. The warmth from the fire seemed to wrap around him, but it was the quiet presence of the bears that filled his heart with peace. In that moment, he understood something profound, that kindness, no matter how small, could bridge even the wildest of gaps between man and nature. As the cub shifted in its sleep, Tomas smiled. There was still much to face in the wilderness, but for now, Tomas knew he had made a difference. He had given them shelter, food, and safety when they needed it most. And in return, they had shared their trust, something that felt more valuable than anything Tomas had ever known. As the first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, Tomas looked out at the snowy world, filled with a quiet hope he hadn't known before.